The world had always believed it was invincible. Technological marvels stretched across continents, and the human race stood at the peak of its achievements. But that belief shattered in a single cataclysmic moment. The sky split open, not with the soft glow of dawn, but with the roar of monstrous alien warships that blotted out the sun. It wasn't a slow invasion, nor a drawn-out battle. It was an instant, an assault from the stars that took humanity by surprise. Captain Elijah Grant had been at the front lines of many wars, but none like this. He had seen the horrors of war, felt the gut-wrenching pain of loss, but nothing could have prepared him for the sheer scale of destruction the Vril unleash. Earth's military, once considered the most powerful in the world, was decimated within hours. The Vril's weapons, laser cannons that tore through buildings with ease, and energy shields that rendered human defenses useless, were unlike anything Earth had ever seen. Entire cities crumbled under their assault, and the world's military forces fell silent, their communications cut off. The Vril had won before Earth could even fully comprehend the threat. Grant's heart hammered as he stood on the rooftop of what used to be the Pentagon, his eyes glued to the massive Vril ship descending toward Washington, D.C. The city was already burning, black smoke rising into the air like the funeral pyre of civilization. He was alone now, one of the last survivors of the American forces. His entire squad was gone, vaporized in the initial strike. He had narrowly escaped death twice before, and now, standing on that rooftop, he felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. His wife, his 2 kids, they were all gone, just another casualty of an invasion no one had seen coming. The Vril didn't even care to negotiate. They didn't need Earth's resources. They were here to conquer, to dominate. Grant clenched his fists, the searing pain of loss burning his chest. But amid that pain, something else stirred: rage. The Vril had taken everything from him, from humanity, and he would be damned if he would sit back and let them destroy the world. It was time to fight back. He snapped into action, grabbing a rifle from a fallen soldier and sprinting toward the broken streets below. It was chaos, a war zone that felt like the end of the world. People screamed as they fled, their lives reduced to mere pawns in a game of intergalactic conquest. But amidst the terror, Grant saw a glimmer of hope, small groups of survivors banding together, fighting the Vril with what little they had left. There were still pockets of resistance, though disorganized and fragmented. As Grant moved through the ruins, he encountered others, survivors, military personnel, civilians, all determined to fight, to survive. His instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he began to gather them. A former Navy SEAL named Marcus, who had lost his entire team in an ambush. A young hacker, Mara, who had watched her family perish in the initial wave, and a few others who had managed to escape the initial onslaught. They were disparate, broken, and scared, but they were alive. That was enough. Grant knew they couldn't fight the Vril head-on. They weren't strong enough, and the alien forces were far too advanced. But there was something humans had that the Vril didn't: an unbreakable will to survive, a refusal to go quietly into the dark. Grant's eyes hardened with resolve as he looked around at the team he'd assembled. He was no longer just fighting for survival. He was fighting for vengeance. "We'll make them regret this," Grant said, his voice cold and determined. "Every single one of them. They've taken our homes, our families, our future, but they haven't taken our will. We are the last line of defense for Earth, and I swear to you, we will make them bleed." The survivors looked at him, some unsure, others hardened by loss. But they nodded. It was an unspoken bond, a shared understanding. They were in this together now, and they would not rest until the Vril paid for every drop of blood they had spilled. The Bloodbound Legion was born in that moment, forged from the ashes of a dying world, and they swore an oath of vengeance that would carry them through the darkest hours to come. The Bloodbound Legion was born in the rubble of a dying world, but the Vril were far from beaten. They had taken everything from humanity in one fell swoop, but Grant knew that revenge would not come easily. For every move the Legion made, the Vril retaliated with brutal precision. They had no concept of mercy, no hesitation when it came to eradicating those who dared defy them. But that was where the Bloodbound Legion would thrive. Against the odds, fighting with a ferocity the Vril could not predict. Captain Elijah Grant stood in front of a group of survivors who had gathered in what used to be a military safe house beneath the ruins of Washington, D.C. A map of the city, scratched and torn, lay on the table in front of him, covered in various colored markers that indicated Vril positions. They were everywhere now, patrolling the skies, commanding the streets, and enforcing their cruel occupation. We can't go head-to-head with them. Not yet, Grant said, his voice steady as he addressed the group. We need to hit them where it hurts. Strike fast, disappear, and keep them guessing. If we do this right, we'll slow them down long enough to start building a real resistance. Mara, the young hacker who had been working tirelessly since the invasion, raised her hand, her face set with determination. I found something. A weakness. The Vril have these massive supply convoys that cross the city every night. Fuel, weapons, and most importantly, communications. I've tapped into their network. If we destroy those convoys, we can cripple their operations for days. Grant's eyes narrowed as he studied the data on the screen in front of him. He had expected resistance movements to be scattered, disorganized, but Mara's information could be the turning point. This was their chance. This is it, Grant muttered, more to himself than anyone else. We take out their convoys, and the Vril will think we're just a nuisance. A few attacks here and there, but we'll have them on the back foot. We disrupt their supply chains and their communication, and we'll force them to waste resources on something they don't even understand. The team nodded, understanding the importance of the mission. They would be taking the fight directly to the heart of the Vril war machine, and they'd need every bit of skill. They had to make it out alive. The plan was simple. Split into two teams. One would plant explosives on the supply convoy routes, taking out the Vril's critical fuel and weapons. The second team would hijack their communications, feeding false information back to their commanders and drawing them into a trap. It wasn't foolproof. The Vril were smart, and their technology was far beyond anything humanity had ever seen. But if there was one thing that the Bloodbound Legion had in abundance, it was ingenuity. Night fell, and the Legion's assault began. Grant's team moved through the shadows of what had once been a bustling city, their footsteps silent against the cracked asphalt. They had scouted the routes for days, memorizing the patrol patterns of the Vril's forces. Every step was calculated, every moment steeped in urgency. The convoy would be passing through a narrow street in 30 minutes. They didn't have time to waste. Mara, with her hacking equipment, led the second team to a high vantage point overlooking the route. Her hands moved quickly, fingers tapping away at her portable terminal. The air around them hummed with tension as the first convoy appeared on the horizon. A convoy of heavily armored Vril transports, their engines roaring like thunder. The convoy was surrounded by armored drones, and Grant knew that if they weren't careful, the mission would be over before it even started. Ready, Mara whispered into their comms. The drones are linked to their communication network. If we can bring down their comms, they'll be blind for at least a few minutes. Grant glanced at his squad. His jaw was tight, eyes steely. No mistakes. We hit them hard, then disappear. The first explosion rocked the convoy, sending Vril soldiers scrambling as fire and debris filled the street. The transport screeched to a halt, their engines smoking as the blast reverberated through the area. The Legion's team, well hidden in the alleyways, moved swiftly, planting more explosives on the remaining convoy vehicles. As the smoke billowed into the night sky, the second team, led by Mara, initiated their hack. The communication system crackled to life as Mara flooded the Vril network with fake signals, sending their command units into disarray. The drones, momentarily confused, began to fly erratically, firing blindly into the air. But the Vril weren't without response. Within minutes, reinforcements were on the way, and the Legion knew they had to vanish. They couldn't risk being caught. As Grant's team planted the final explosive, they retreated into the shadows, each soldier moving with the precision of a well-oiled machine. But as they made their way through the wreckage, a sudden sound stopped them in their tracks. The low hum of a Vril warship's engine. Grant turned, his pulse racing. He knew that the Vril would waste no time in responding to the attack. Reinforcements were coming, and they were coming fast. "Mara, get us out of here," Grant commanded, his voice sharp. Mara didn't hesitate. Her fingers flew across the keys, sending a final burst of data that cut off the Vril's communications entirely. The ship's humming grew louder, but by the time it arrived, the Legion was long gone. They'd vanished into the night, leaving the Vril to sift through the wreckage of their shattered convoy. Grant stood at the edge of the ruined street, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. The mission had been a success, minor, but significant. They had struck the Vril in their own territory, and they had escaped with their lives. But Grant knew the fight was just beginning. This was only the first of many strikes, and with each one, the Bloodbound Legion would make sure the Vril knew that humanity would never bow down. Vengeance had begun. The taste of victory was fleeting. The Vril were no fools. They responded to the Bloodbound Legion's attacks with swift and deadly force. What had begun as a hopeful spark of resistance was quickly met with retaliation. But as the Legion lay low in the remnants of an old military bunker, licking their wounds and preparing for the next strike, they didn't just face the Vril's wrath. They were blindsided by something far more dangerous. It began with whispers, rumors of betrayal, a missing soldier, a broken radio. The silence that followed every operation. Captain Grant had been expecting the Vril to counterattack. He hadn't expected his own people to turn against him. One night, as the team gathered for a debrief, the reality hit. The small, closely knit group that had fought so hard to survive was slowly splintering. Their camaraderie, born of shared loss and a common purpose, was fraying at the edges. The whispers had been true. Someone within their ranks was feeding information to the Vril. Their most recent sabotage mission, a flawless strike on a Vril weapons depot, had somehow led the enemy straight to their hideout. The Vril's retaliatory strike had nearly wiped out the entire resistance group. Only a handful of them had escaped. Grant was livid, pacing in the dimly lit room. The walls, once a symbol of human resilience, now seemed like a prison. He couldn't afford to lose anyone. Not now. Not when they were so close to crippling the Vril's control. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His gut told him there was more to the situation than a simple spy. It was Mara who spoke first, her voice calm but full of the cold rage they all felt. "We've been sabotaged, Captain. I'm not just talking about a mole. There's someone inside our ranks who knew too much, someone who could pass information in ways we didn't anticipate." Grant's eyes narrowed. He trusted Mara implicitly, and if she said there was something deeper at play, he knew better than to dismiss it. The hacker had a gift for reading patterns in data, and the encryption on their comms had been breached more than once in ways that weren't random. Marcus, the former Navy SEAL, crossed his arms and leaned back against a wall, his face a mask of frustration. "We've got to figure out who it is. Every attack we launch is another chance for them to screw us over." Grant nodded grimly. He wasn't just fighting the Vril anymore. He was fighting the poison within his own ranks. The very thing that kept him up at night was now his greatest threat. A traitor. In the days that followed, tensions mounted within the Bloodbound Legion. Trust, once the foundation of their unity, now hung by a thread. Every mission was approached with suspicion. Every glance exchanged was scrutinized. The once solid bond between the team members was now fractured. Some of the soldiers grew increasingly paranoid, pointing fingers, accusing one another of betrayal. Every face was now a mask. No one could be sure who was truly loyal. The betrayal hit hardest for Grant. He had built this team from the ashes of his old life. Each soldier in the Legion had a story, a reason for fighting, and yet one of them had turned their back on everything they stood for. Grant refused to believe it was one of the core members. But the signs were undeniable. The Vril knew too much. It was during a routine mission, one designed to intercept a convoy of alien weapons, that the truth finally came to light. The operation had been a trap. Grant's team had gotten too comfortable, too predictable. The Vril were waiting for them. As the team pushed through the smoke-filled streets of a former military base, they were ambushed by a squad of Vril soldiers, heavily armored and armed with deadly plasma rifles. The battle that ensued was fierce, but there was a moment, a single, gut-wrenching moment, when everything went wrong. One of their own Jacks, a former Vril sympathizer who had joined the Bloodbound Legion after the invasion, turned on them. Grant's heart sank as he saw Jax pull a weapon from under his jacket. The betrayal was as sharp as a knife in his chest. The soldier who had once sworn an oath to fight for humanity, for vengeance, was the one who had been leaking information to the enemy. The Vril had known exactly where the Legion would be. "Jax, what the hell are you doing?" Grant demanded, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Jax's eyes were empty, cold. "You think I'd let you keep throwing away lives for a lost cause? We've already lost. It's time to face the truth. The Vril are unstoppable." Grant's fists clenched as the weight of betrayal crushed him. He trusted Jax, had fought beside him. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. But as the enemy closed in, there was no time to confront the traitor further. They were outnumbered, surrounded. Mara's voice crackled in Grant's ear. "Captain, we're not done yet. We need to pull back, now." There was no room for hesitation. Grant's heart still burned with anger, but he shoved it aside. His team, what was left of it, needed him. With a final, resolute look at Jax, Grant turned and ordered his squad to retreat. The explosion that followed was deafening. They couldn't afford to take down Jax now. He was a threat, but the Vril were a bigger one. The retreat was chaotic, but they made it out alive. As they regrouped in a safe house, battered and broken, the gravity of what had just occurred set in. Their ranks had been pierced, and trust, once their most powerful weapon, was gone. But there was no time to mourn. There was still work to do. Mara spoke, her voice quiet but filled with a fire that Grant hadn't heard in her before. "This doesn't end here. We know what we're up against. The Vril think they've won a battle, but they haven't seen the real fight yet." Grant nodded, feeling the weight of his team's loss, and the weight of what lay ahead. The Bloodbound Legion had been betrayed, but they were still alive. And with vengeance in their hearts, they would fight on. The Vril hadn't broken them yet. The betrayal of Jax weighed heavily on the Bloodbound Legion. The tight-knit group that had once worked together as a seamless unit now felt fractured. Its foundation cracked and fragile. But as hard as the sting of the traitors' actions was, they had no choice but to push forward. The fight was far from over. The Vril's grip on Earth was tightening, and Grant knew they couldn't afford to sit in the shadows, licking their wounds. The Bloodbound Legion had been dealt a blow, but they were far from broken. Days passed in a blur of tactical planning and forced distance. There was no time for grief, no room for anger. The Legion couldn't afford to collapse, not when every moment mattered. But despite their resolve, something inside the team had shifted. There was a palpable tension, an unspoken distrust that lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. Captain Grant could feel it. Every time he looked at the faces of his remaining soldiers, the weight of Jax's betrayal hung like a shadow over them. He could see the worry in Marcus's eyes, the sharp edge in Mara's voice when she spoke of future missions. They were all waiting for the next betrayal to surface, unsure of who they could trust. But in this war, there was no room for hesitation, no room for weakness. The Bloodbound Legion had one chance, to cripple the Vril's operations and slow their march toward total domination. And that chance lay in a single heavily guarded target, the Vril's flagship battle cruiser, Scorn of Vril. It wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol of the Vril's might, an invulnerable fortress in the sky. The cruiser had been hovering in low orbit for weeks, overseeing their war efforts, and Grant knew that its destruction could change the course of the war. If they succeeded, they could turn the tide. But if they failed, it would be a final devastating blow to the resistance. The plan was simple, at least in theory. Infiltrate the Scorn of Vril, plant explosives in its core systems, and detonate it from within. It was a suicide mission, no doubt. The cruiser's defenses were nearly impenetrable, and the Vril's elite soldiers would be waiting for them. But this was their only shot. The Legion had to move quickly, taking advantage of a fleeting window of opportunity. The Vril had been distracted by another attack on their ground forces, leaving the flagship vulnerable for a short period. Grant couldn't waste it. As the team prepared to launch their assault, the tension between them was palpable. They were all fully aware of the risks, but now, more than ever, they had to trust one another. Grant couldn't afford to second-guess anyone. He had to believe in their resolve. His resolve. "Let's get this done," Grant said, his voice steady, though his heart thundered in his chest. They were flying blind. There was no backup, no reinforcements. This would be a hit-and-run operation, the kind that demanded precision and speed. If they didn't act fast, the Vril would be ready, and they would be trapped. The plan required them to board the Scorn of Vril during a brief docking period at one of its fuel stations. The team would infiltrate using cloaking tech, and from there, they would split into two groups. One to plant the explosives in the central reactor, the other to sabotage the Vril's primary weapon system, to create chaos. As they boarded the shuttle that would take them to the cruiser, Grant could see the steely determination in their eyes. There was fear, yes, it was inevitable. But there was also something else. A fire. A refusal to back down. Mara was the first to speak as the shuttle's doors closed, her voice a low whisper in the dark. "If we pull this off, we'll cripple them. They'll think twice before coming back to Earth." Grant nodded. He hadn't been this close to the enemy in months, and there was something almost sacred about being on the verge of striking at the heart of the Vril's power. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about survival. Earth had no future if the Vril were allowed to continue their conquest. The shuttle slipped past the Scorn of Vril's defenses, cloaked and unnoticed. They made their way through the docking bay, silent as shadows. But just as they neared their destination, the Vril struck. A sharp, shrill alarm echoed through the station, signaling a breach in their systems. "Damn it," Marcus muttered, his hand on his rifle. "They were expecting us." A group of Vril soldiers, clad in their fearsome, blackened armor, stormed the docking bay. The Legion immediately went into combat mode, opening fire with precision. The battle was a blur of blaster shots and steel. Grant could feel the weight of every decision, knowing that each moment they spent fighting could cost them their chance to complete the mission. "Move," Grant shouted, as explosions lit up the corridor around them. The enemy was relentless, but the Legion was faster, more agile. They worked like a well-oiled machine, dodging, weaving, and taking out their opponents with ruthless efficiency. But as they made their way deeper into the ship, the true danger became clear. The cruiser was alive with Vril forces. Every hall, every room, was crawling with armed soldiers and automated defenses. No one was safe, not even for a moment. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the Scorn of Vril, the more they felt the crushing weight of their mission. This was it, the breaking point. Grant's heart raced as they reached the reactor room. The team was battered, but they had made it. He was about to set the charge when a voice, sharp and cold, cut through the chaos. "Give it up, Grant." Standing in the doorway was Skother, the Vril commander who had personally led the invasion of Earth. His red eyes glinted with amusement as he leveled his weapon at Grant. "You think you can destroy my ship?" The cold, calculating gaze of Sothar, the Vril commander, sent a chill down Grant's spine. This was the monster that had nearly wiped out humanity. This was the creature responsible for the deaths of billions, the very one whose presence had shattered Earth's defenses. And now, here he was, standing in front of Grant, confident in his victory. Grant's pulse hammered in his ears, his mind racing. They were surrounded, cornered in the reactor room, with only moments to detonate the charges that could bring down the entire ship. But Sother's presence, the way he stood so calmly, almost arrogantly, felt like an insurmountable wall between them and their goal. "You won't stop me," Sother said, his voice smooth and deadly. "I've seen the best of your kind die. Your resistance is futile. You will fail just like the others." Grant clenched his fists, the anger rising in him like a wildfire. Not this time. He had promised to make them bleed, and he would keep that promise, no matter what. "Mara, Marcus," Grant whispered, keeping his voice steady despite the situation. "Do it. Now." Mara and Marcus exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable, but they didn't hesitate. Marcus raised his rifle, firing a few suppressing shots toward the Vril commander. Sother effortlessly deflected the shots with his energy shield, but it was enough to give Mara the opening she needed. With quick, practiced movements, she set a small device in the corner of the reactor room. The blinking red light indicated it was ready. "Charge is set," Mara said, her voice cold but determined. "We've got 5 minutes before it blows. Let's go." Grant didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Mara's arm, pulling her toward the exit, but Sother was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He raised his hand, and with a mere flick of his wrist, a searing beam of energy shot toward the team, cutting off their escape. "Mara, go!" Grant yelled, throwing himself in front of her to shield her from the blast. The beam sliced across his shoulder, and pain exploded in his chest. He stumbled but didn't fall, gritting his teeth against the agony. He couldn't afford to fall now. Sother's mocking laughter filled the room. "You think I didn't foresee this? You're no different from the others who thought they could stand against me." Marcus sprinted forward, diving toward the Vril commander, but Sother was faster. He effortlessly sidestepped Marcus's attack, knocking him aside with a brutal strike that sent him crashing into a nearby console. Grant pushed through the searing pain in his shoulder, forcing himself to stand tall. "We're not like the others." With a growl, he lunged at Sother, his rifle raised. The Vril commander moved like a shadow, effortlessly dodging the blast. The two clashed in a brutal dance of violence, Grant's attacks wild but fueled by sheer desperation and fury. But Sother's superior strength and agility overwhelmed him, knocking the rifle from his hands and sending him sprawling to the ground. "Pathetic," Sother spat, lifting Grant by the collar and slamming him into the reactor wall. "You think you can destroy what we've built? This is our world now. You are nothing." Grant's vision blurred, the pain in his body threatening to overtake him. His thoughts faltered, but in the haze of his growing weakness, a single thought surged forward, a memory of his family, of the promise he'd made to protect humanity. His eyes narrowed, and despite the crushing weight of despair, a spark of defiance flared in his chest. "You're wrong," Grant said through gritted teeth. "This is our world, and you'll never take it from us." He reached for the detonator strapped to his belt, his hand shaking but determined. As he pressed the button, the sound of a timer began to echo in the room. "No!" Sother screamed, realizing too late what was happening. He dropped Grant and turned toward the reactor core in a panic, his hands outstretched, but it was already too late. The reactor core shuddered, and the ship's alarms blared, a deafening wail signaling the impending destruction. Sother's eyes, full of fury, locked with Grant's for a fleeting moment before the entire room was engulfed in blinding light. The explosion was catastrophic, a blast that ripped through the heart of the scorn of Vril with the fury of 1,000 storms. The shockwave sent Grant flying across the room, his body slamming into a wall with brutal force. His vision went black. When Grant came to, the world was a hazy blur. His body ached with every breath, but he was alive. Weakly, he pushed himself up, his mind slowly clearing. The stench of smoke and burning metal filled the air, and the walls around him were cracked, some crumbling from the impact of the explosion. But the ship, it was gone. The Scorn of Vril had been destroyed. Mara was beside him, her face pale but determined. She pulled him to his feet with surprising strength, her eyes scanning the wreckage for any sign of Marcus. "We did it, Captain. We actually did it." Grant's heart was still pounding in his chest, but he allowed himself a moment of relief. They had succeeded. They had struck the Vril at their core. The flagship was gone. But the war was far from over. "We're not done yet," Grant said, his voice ragged but resolute. He could still feel the weight of the mission ahead. "We've made our mark. Now we make them feel it." As the remnants of the Scorn of Vril slowly began to drift into space, the team's victory was bittersweet. The price had been high, but they had dealt the Vril a blow they wouldn't forget. And as long as the Bloodbound Legion still stood, Earth's fight would continue. The remnants of the Scorn of Vril drifted like broken shards of a shattered dream, floating in the void of space. Its once proud hull, now riddled with explosive craters, was a testament to the Bloodbound Legion's resolve. But as the team picked their way through the wreckage, there was no room for celebration. They had won a battle, but the war, earth-shattering in its scale, was far from over. Grant's chest ached with the aftermath of the blast. His shoulder throbbed, still burning from the energy beam Sothar had struck him with. But it was the weight of what lay ahead that pressed hardest on his soul. They had crippled the Vril's flagship, a symbol of their invincibility. But even now, he could feel the Vril's anger brewing. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. They would retaliate. They always did. The team limped back to their hidden base on Earth, battered but alive. But the atmosphere among them was tense, strained. They had faced a harrowing challenge, but they had also seen the harsh reality of war. Their numbers had dwindled, and the betrayal of Jax still stung, even if he hadn't been there to witness the victory. The base was a hollow shell, a remnant of the old world. The flickering lights were the only signs of life in the darkened corridors. Yet it was a haven, at least for now. "We've done it," Marcus said, his voice hoarse, but there was a strange hollowness in his words. He stood in front of a cracked monitor, staring at the feed of the aftermath. "But the Vril aren't going to sit still. They'll come after us with everything they've got." Grant nodded, his gaze locked on the display. "We knew this wasn't going to be easy. The Scorn of Vril was just a symbol, a beginning. The Vril are vast, and this won't break their will." He paused, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "But they've seen what we can do. The next move is ours. We hit them again. Harder." Mara, sitting at a console, ran her fingers through her hair. She was exhausted, as were they all. But there was a spark in her eyes. "I've been digging through their comms. There's a large fleet of Vril warships moving toward Earth's orbit. They're regrouping, possibly launching a full-scale retaliation." Her fingers tapped a series of commands, bringing up a map of their movements. "We can't just wait for them to get here. If we strike fast, we can cripple their reinforcements before they land." "Is there anything in their communications that tells us where they'll hit first?" Grant asked, leaning over her shoulder. His mind was already whirring with the possibility of their next strike. Mara's brow furrowed as she scanned the data. "There's one key site, a hidden command center just outside the city limits. If they get control of that, they'll have full access to Earth's defense systems. We can't let that happen." Grant's jaw tightened. "Then that's where we go. We don't have much time." The team geared up quickly, their movements automatic as they prepped their weapons and armor. Despite the exhaustion etched into their faces, there was a resolve that burned beneath it all. They were tired. They were battered. But they were far from finished. The Bloodbound Legion was still standing, and if there was one thing they had learned from the Vril, it was that survival was the hardest fight of all. The assault on the command center was swift, a surgical strike designed to incapacitate, not destroy. Grant's team had learned to fight smarter, not harder. They were outnumbered, but they used the terrain, the shadows, and their wits to stay one step ahead of the enemy. Mara's hacking expertise allowed them to slip past most of the Vril's surveillance, leaving only confusion in their wake. But as they infiltrated the heavily fortified base, the tension became palpable. They knew the Vril would be waiting for them. And sure enough, the moment they breached the outer wall, they found themselves face to face with a heavily armed battalion of Vril soldiers, their red eyes glowing with the promise of death. Grant wasted no time. He drew his weapon and charged, leading the team with ferocity. Plasma blasts whizzed past him as they engaged the enemy head-on. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire and explosions, the base shaking under the impact of the battle. Marcus and Mara took position, covering Grant's flank, while he pressed forward, cutting through the Vril forces with ruthless efficiency. For every Vril soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take their place. But the team didn't waver. They couldn't afford to. The command center was just ahead, and they couldn't let it fall into enemy hands. Mara hacked into the central terminal, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. "I'm in," she muttered, her face lit by the glow of the monitor. "I've got access to their mainframe. I can lock them out of the system, but we need to hold them off for a few minutes." Grant didn't hesitate. He waved Marcus forward. "Get to the door. We need to buy her time." They fought with everything they had, pushing deeper into the heart of the command center. Grant could feel the weight of every second ticking away, but there was no turning back now. He was leading them into the belly of the beast, and for once, the beast would know what it felt like to be hunted. The Vril were relentless, but the Legion was tougher. They didn't have the luxury of fear. As Mara finished locking down the system, the Vril forces began to retreat, but not without one last deadly attempt to eliminate them. A larger, heavily armored Vril unit surged forward, weapons primed. "Take cover," Marcus shouted, just as the heavy guns opened fire. The team scrambled to avoid the onslaught, ducking behind pillars and makeshift barricades as the Vril advanced. Their backs were against the wall, but Grant refused to let them go down without a fight. They had come too far, endured too much, to fail now. As the last of the Vril forces fell, Grant allowed himself a brief exhale. The command center was secured, but it wasn't over yet. The war was only just beginning, and the Bloodbound Legion would be there to see it through to the end. The command center was silent now, the hum of the systems the only sound that filled the cavernous room. The Bloodbound Legion had secured it, but even in their brief moment of triumph, they knew they had only gained a temporary advantage. The Vril were relentless, and the retreating enemy soldiers had already started to regroup. Their response would come soon, and it would be vicious. Grant wiped the sweat from his brow, exhaustion weighing down on him, but there was no time to rest. Mara was already poring over the systems, her fingers moving in rapid succession over the console, her face lit by the faint glow of the monitors. "How are we looking?" Grant asked, moving to stand beside her. Mara didn't look up, but her voice was steady. "I've locked them out of the command systems, but it won't hold long. They'll be able to override it once they regroup and adapt. We've bought ourselves a window, but it's not a big one." Grant nodded. "Then we use it." He turned to Marcus, who was standing guard near the door, his weapon ready and eyes sharp. "We need to keep moving. This place won't stay secure for long." Marcus gave him a grim nod. "Understood, Captain. We'll cover you while Mara finishes what she's doing." Grant gave a quick nod of approval, then turned his attention back to Mara. "Keep us updated. Don't let them retake control. We're not going to let this be for nothing." With the team set, they began their next phase. Their mission had always been more than just holding the line. It was about forcing the Vril to play by humanity's rules. They would strike swiftly, decisively, before the Vril could regroup and retaliate. The air outside the command center was thick with tension, the weight of impending doom settling heavily on the squad. Every footstep echoed in the silence, and every shadow seemed to hold the threat of an ambush. But the Bloodbound Legion wasn't afraid. They had fought too hard, suffered too much, to let fear control them now. As they moved toward the exterior of the facility, Marcus suddenly signaled them to halt. His expression was tight, his eyes scanning the area. "Something's not right," he muttered, his voice low but urgent. "We've got incoming." Grant's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, his eyes narrowing. "How many?" "Can't tell yet," Marcus replied, his hand hovering near the rifle strapped to his back. "But they're coming fast. Too fast." The sound of distant engines soon confirmed Marcus's suspicion. A Vril strike force, reinforcements likely sent to recapture the command center, was on its way. The hum of their ships could be heard in the distance, a mechanical growl that rattled the air. The team had no time to escape. They had to hold this ground or risk being overwhelmed. "Get to cover," Grant ordered, and the team scrambled to find any form of protection. Marcus and Grant took the front, crouching behind a set of concrete pillars. Mara, too, found cover nearby, her fingers flying over the terminal again, trying to lock the doors and systems that could slow the enemy's advance. "We're going to have to fight our way out of this," Grant said, eyes scanning the horizon. The ships were almost on top of them now. "Prepare for contact." A series of violent impacts shook the ground as the first Vril assault ships landed, their engines roaring as they settled in a wide semicircle around the base. The heavy thud of boots against the cracked earth followed, and the enemy forces emerged, hundreds of them, fully armored, weapons drawn. "This is it," Marcus muttered, voice grim but resolute. "They're not playing around anymore." The Vril advanced in an organized formation, moving as one, their tactics far more honed than anything the Legion had encountered before. These weren't just soldiers, they were elite warriors, and they knew exactly how to break their enemies. The team opened fire, and the battle erupted in an instant. Plasma beams shot across the open space, and the Bloodbound Legion fought with everything they had, taking down Vril soldiers one by one. But for every Vril that fell, another seemed to take their place, and soon the battlefield was a chaotic tangle of gunfire and explosions. Grant fought with a single-minded fury. He had lost too much already to let the Vril win. The images of earth burning of his fallen comrades haunted him, and he channeled that pain into every shot, every movement. Mara was close by, picking off targets with precision, her usually steady hands now betraying the weight of the situation. Her hacking skills had bought them a critical advantage earlier, but now she was forced to fight for her life. "Captain," Mara shouted, her voice sharp, "I got the system locked, but it won't hold forever. We need to move now." Grant knew what that meant. If they didn't get out soon, the Vril would retake control of the command center, and it would be over. The Bloodbound Legion had no more time to fight. "Fall back," he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to move out now." The team began to retreat, laying down suppressing fire as they moved back toward the interior of the base. They were outnumbered, but they had the advantage of knowing the terrain. Marcus led the charge, clearing the path, while Grant and Mara provided cover. Just as they were nearing the entrance to the facility, a sudden explosion ripped through the ground, knocking Grant off his feet. The blast was deafening, and debris rained down around them. His vision swam, and he felt his body slam into the earth, pain radiating through his skull. "Captain," Marcus shouted, scrambling to his side. Grant pushed himself up, blood dripping from a wound to his head, but his resolve was unwavering. "We don't stop. Not until they're gone." The sky above them was filled with smoke, the once clear view now clouded by the storm of war. Grant's mind raced, but he knew one thing with certainty. Earth wasn't going down without a fight. The Vril might control the skies, but the Bloodbound Legion controlled the will to survive. They wouldn't stop. They couldn't. The war was only getting started, and the price of victory had never been higher. The explosion had thrown Grant into a dark haze, and for a moment, he thought he had lost his grip on reality. The sounds around him, The sharp crackle of static, the distant rumble of battle, the pressure building in his skull, felt muffled and unreal. His body was heavy, bruised, but he was alive. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself to his knees. His vision blurred, and for a split second, he couldn't remember where he was. "Mara, Marcus," he shouted, his voice raspy, but it cut through the chaos in his mind like a beacon. "Here, Captain." Mara's voice came through the static, a lifeline in the dark. Her face appeared in his blurry vision, worried but determined. She helped him stand, supporting his weight as he steadied himself. "We're still in this," Grant muttered, shaking his head to clear it. The pain in his skull was sharp, but it wasn't enough to stop him. The Bloodbound Legion had fought too long and too hard to let one explosion take them out. "We need to move." The world around him was a war zone. The base had been partially destroyed, debris scattered in every direction. The distant hum of enemy ships filled the air, signaling that the Vril were closing in fast. But even with their numbers overwhelming, Grant refused to back down. This was their home, their fight. "Where's Marcus?" he asked, his head swiveling as he searched the battlefield. "I'm here." Marcus's voice came from the smoke-filled haze. He was running toward them, his armor scuffed, but his weapon still firmly in hand. "We need to go, now." Grant didn't need any further prompting. They were down to only a handful of soldiers, and every second counted. The Vril's reinforcements were getting closer, and they had no intention of letting this operation fail. They had no intention of letting humanity fail. "Fall back to the escape route," Grant ordered, his voice firm despite the pounding in his head. "We've held them off long enough. It's time to finish this." The trio moved swiftly, making their way through the wreckage. Grant's mind raced. He thought of everything they'd sacrificed to get here, the lives of their fallen comrades, the pain they'd endured, the price they had paid. It was all on the line now. The Vril might have superior technology, but humanity had something they didn't: will. The Bloodbound Legion wasn't just fighting to survive. They were fighting for Earth itself. As they neared the escape tunnel, Marcus checked the perimeter. "We'll have about 5 minutes before they realize we've moved out. That's our window." Grant nodded grimly. They were running on borrowed time, but they had one last advantage: the weapon. In the chaos of the retreat, they had discovered a hidden weapon inside the command center. An experimental antimatter device designed to destroy enemy ships in one massive strike. It was dangerous, unstable, but in their hands, it could deliver a final crippling blow to the Vril fleet. "We're doing this," Grant said. "We hit them with everything we've got. The Vril won't know what hit them." Mara worked quickly at the terminal, connecting the device to the control panel. She was focused, every movement precise as she activated the antimatter weapon. The countdown began. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls as the system powered up. "This is it," she said, her voice steady, but Grant could hear the weight behind it. "Once this goes off, the Vril won't be able to stop us." They gathered their equipment, the escape tunnel's entrance now just a few meters away. But as the seconds ticked down, the unmistakable roar of Vril engines grew louder. The fleet was coming, and they were going to fight their way through to the end. "Move out," Grant barked. "Get to the exit. We won't get another chance." They ran, the tunnel opening up ahead like a portal to a future they weren't ready to lose. The countdown to destruction echoed in their ears as they sprinted toward the light at the end. The path was narrow, the walls closing in around them, but the weight of their mission pushed them forward. As they reached the exit, Grant spared one last glance back at the base. The world outside was shifting. Dust rising from the impact of distant artillery, the horizon filled with the storm of war. This was their final stand, the last stand for Earth. "Do it," Grant said to Mara, his voice hoarse but determined. "Now." Mara pressed a button on her wrist, and the countdown hit 0. The explosion that followed was like nothing they had ever experienced. A blinding light erupted from the command center, ripping through the air like the very heavens had opened up. The ground trembled as the antimatter device released its destructive force, sending shockwaves through the atmosphere. The Vril ships above shuddered, their systems failing in an instant as the weapon tore into their fleet. Grant stumbled from the blast, but the victory was undeniable. The Vril fleet above Earth had been decimated in one fell swoop. The war wasn't over, but it had taken a decisive turn. The sound of sirens, of alarms ringing through the base, signaled that the Vril were trying to regroup. But the Bloodbound Legion had already given Earth a fighting chance. They had taken the first real step in pushing the invaders back. As the three of them stood in the wreckage of the escape tunnel, looking out at the horizon, they knew the fight wasn't over. They had no illusions that the Vril wouldn't come back with even more force. But for the first time in a long time, they believed humanity had a real shot at victory. "We've done it," Mara said softly, her voice a mixture of awe and relief. Grant looked toward the distant horizon, his heart still pounding with adrenaline. "No, not yet, but we've made them feel it." The war would rage on, but the Bloodbound Legion had made their stand. They had struck a blow that the Vril would never forget, and as long as they lived they would continue to fight, until Earth was free. The Bloodbound Legion wasn't just a name. It was a promise, and they would keep it, no matter the cost.